Welcome to the channel of the writer Javier Correa, known as Prometheus in the underworld. There will be fabulous stories, sensational realities, incredible events. From ghost stories, villain tales, books, magic, art, literature at its best, and the opinion of the writer on various topics. Let's go then.
Today I am going to talk to you about Fidel Castro, one of the most notable figures of the last century. A character who influenced for better or worse South America and part of the world. One of the best known faces in the world. Fidel Castro was born on August 13, 1926 in the farm belonging to his father in Byron, now Holguin province. He was the natural son of a Spanish emigrant from Galicia, Ángel Castro Arguez. His father was an illiterate Spanish peasant, who joined the army in his native country, replacing another conscript who paid him to take his place, and was part of the Spanish army stationed in Cuba, which fought against the Mambises. The Spanish soldiers called Mambises to the independence guerrillas, thanks to a voice of the Bantu language, typical of Africa in the region of Nigeria, in which MBI means insurrectionist. Fidel Castro's father fought in the War of Independence of 1895, and in the Spanish-American War in which Spain lost the Dominion of Cuba. Ángel Castro returned to Spain with the defeated Spanish army in 1898, and returned to Cuba in December 1899 to seek his fortune. An excellent card player, he had very good business intuition and came to work as a contractor with the United Fruit Company cutting wood in the forests and then immediately planting sugar cane. In addition, in a particular way, he was dedicated to the breeding of fighting cocks, which began to generate very good money. He invested the profits from that business by buying land in the countryside of Byron. Later he founded in it his own ranch and called it Manicas, thus achieving economic success and finally becoming a rich landowner in the northern part of the then province of Orient, and today province of Holguin. He came to own 11,000 hectares, between own and leased. He had 500 agricultural workers, many of them Haitians, working in his property. Ángel had a rough character, and was little affectionate. His great friend was Fidel Pino Santos, who helped him to progress in business, and that is why Ángel named one of his sons Fidel. When Fidel was 4 years old he began to study in a school in Byron. His parents decided to send him to Santiago de Cuba at the age of 6, together with his sister Angelita, to the care of the one who had been his teacher in Byron. In spite of the economic situation in 1932, the governess who took care of him used the money sent by Castro's father to support her family. This set the tone for what would become Fidel Castro's life, always living and studying away from home. Fidel would not return except on vacations and significant dates. This is why Fidel Castro was so uprooted and considered his brother Raúl as his only family. Raúl also felt that his only family was Fidel. Fidel was 8.5 years old when he was baptized, and it was not until he was 14 years old that his father obtained a divorce from his first wife, Maria Luisa Argota Reyes, and was able to remarry Fidel Castro's mother, Lina Raz. Both of Fidel Castro's parents were illiterate, although both learned to read in their maturity. He finished high school in June 1945, together with his brother-in-law, Rafael Diaz-Balart, who would be his best friend at the time and later one of his ideological enemies. He entered the University of Havana on September 4, 1945. He enrolled in 3 careers, law, diplomatic law and social sciences, with the intention of obtaining a scholarship to study in Europe or the United States. In 1947, at the age of 21, as president of the Dominican Pro-Democracy Committee of the FEU, he promoted actions to demand the removal of the Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo, and was part of the invasion of Cayo Confis, with the aim of overthrowing him. But dictator Trujillo found out that the Cubans were on their way and phoned the then president of Cuba, Ramon Grau San Martin, and told him that if any Cuban arrived in his territory he would bomb Havana immediately. In 1948 he traveled for the first time outside Cuba, to Caracas, Panama and Colombia, as a delegate to the Inter-American Student Conference to be held in Bogotá. In Colombia he had an appointment to meet with the presidential candidate, Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, the same afternoon that the Cantondado was assassinated, during the revolt known as the Bogotazo. Although it is unlikely that Castro was involved in that crime. Upon his return to Cuba, he married Mirta Diaz-Balart, a philosophy student from a wealthy Havana family. They made their wedding trip to New York, residing at 156 West, 82nd Street in Manhattan. During that time, from this marriage their first son, Fidel Angel Castro Diaz-Balart, was born. During their honeymoon in the United States, General Fulgencio Batista, who had already been president of Cuba and by that time was already living in the United States, gave the couple a considerable amount of money as a wedding gift. Such was the amount of money that Fidel was able to buy a Cadillac automobile. Fidel liked the car so much that he took it back to Cuba. In 1952, General Fulgencio Batista's coup d'état overthrew the government of Carlos Prio Socarrás and annulled the elections. The coup was promoted by the U.S. government to depose Carlos Prio. Fidel Castro denounced Batista before an emergency court for violating the constitution with the coup d'état. The courts rejected the lawsuit, so Castro understood that the armed struggle was legitimized as the only possible way to overthrow the dictatorship. Thus Fidel Castro organized and participated in the elaboration of an armed attack against the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba on July 26. The attempt to take the Moncada barracks was due to the fact that it was strategic because of its position and had at least 3,000 weapons. The plan was to take the Moncada barracks and then take two other barracks and wait for the military to join them in order to depose Batista. The tactic devised consisted of arriving armed and disguised as sergeants, with the only difference being the footwear so that they could recognize each other. Once inside, they would try to use the symbolic value of the rebellion of the sergeants to contact the other garrisons and encourage them to rise up. If the rebellion did not receive support, the idea was to escape to the mountains and arm the people to continue the struggle. The attempt failed. Some citizens tried to help them and hide them, many were caught, although Castro managed to escape with some men to the Sierra Maestra. Days walking, they decided to enter a small house in the mountains to rest, where they were surprised while sleeping. Fidel Castro was taken prisoner, tried and sentenced to 15 years in prison. It is said that General Fulgencio Batista was going to kill Fidel Castro after the failed assault to the Moncada barracks, but the families of Fidel Castro and his wife asked him to spare his life, turning to the intermediation of the Catholic Church. Fulgencio Batista agreed to spare Fidel's life, but it is said that he had him castrated for being ungrateful. Let's remember that during their wedding trip, Batista gave them a large sum of money. After 22 months in prison he was released during the general amnesty of May 1955. Months later he went into exile in the United States and finally to Mexico. Castro obtained financing in the United States for his attempt to overthrow Batista. It was oil tycoon John Davidson Rockefeller himself who provided the money for Fidel Castro to train and finance the attempt to overthrow dictator Batista. Raúl Castro, Fidel's inseparable brother, had already begun to organize the insurgent movement against Batista in Mexico. Mexico was the logical choice for all those guerrillas from Central and Latin American countries exiled and resentful of the United States, because in 1938 Mexican President Lázaro Cárdenas had marked a halt in American and British power by nationalizing the oil industry. In Mexico, the 82 members of Fidel's team were trained for combat and left for Cuba when the day came. Among them were Camilo Cienfuegos, the most charismatic of them, Raúl Castro, Juan Almeida and Che Guevara. Camilo was an average Cuban who learned good values at home. In fact, his father once said that Camilo had learned the revolution at home. And his arrival with Fidel was relatively casual. During a demonstration in the city of Havana, he was shot in the leg by a member of Batista's government. He was arrested for being one of the demonstrators, and was even accused and branded a communist and spent time in jail. This experience most likely radicalized him. Once free, He went into exile in Mexico and went to look for one of his fellow countrymen who had been released under the same amnesty as Fidel Castro. He introduces him to Fidel and his brother Raúl a month and a half before they were scheduled to return to Cuba to overthrow Batista. Another member was Ernesto Che Guevara, an asthmatic Argentine who came from a wealthy family in Argentina. He was nicknamed El Chancho, the pig, because his hygiene was very poor and he always stank. As a medical student, he dropped out of medical school to go on a motorcycle trip with his friend Alberto Granados through South America. They travel from Buenos Aires along the coast of Argentina, and then go to Patagonia, up through Chile where the motorcycle breaks down. But they continue on foot and hitchhiking. From Chile to Peru, then to Colombia and to Venezuela. After 7 months of travel, Alberto Granados stays in Venezuela. Che returns to Buenos Aires to finish his medical studies. He finishes his degree and starts a new trip that takes him to Guatemala. There he is introduced to Hilda Gadea, who falls in love with Che and puts him in contact with Fidel Castro and his group. Guatemala, the government is trying to make a social transformation for the benefit of its people, and tries to take land from several American companies to give it to Guatemalan peasants. But companies like the fruit company were very powerful and asked for help from the United States. The intervention of the United States through the CIA ends in the removal of President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, the president of Guatemala. It was the first coup d'état sponsored by the CIA in America in 1954. Ernesto Che Guevara is very disillusioned with this event and his resentment towards the Americans grows. Castillo Armas becomes the new president of Guatemala and persecutes the communists. Che takes refuge in the Argentine embassy and goes to Mexico like other leftists. In Mexico, he contacts the group of Cubans and Raúl Castro who were preparing to return to Cuba and overthrow the dictator Fulgencio Batista. On November 25, 1955, they traveled to Cuba on the Granma yacht that they had bought in Mexico from an American citizen. But they arrived in Cuba 2 days later than planned, due to bad weather and rough seas. The Castro allies who were supposed to be waiting for them on the Cuban coast are no longer there. Instead, the army is waiting for them. As soon as they begin to disembark, the army opens fire on them. They flee, and on the way to the Sierra Maestra they face another army battalion. After the 2 confrontations, few were able to escape. Only 17 men survive out of the original 82 guerrillas that Fidel was carrying. The action fails. The few survivors, including Ernesto Che Guevara, Raúl Castro, Juan Almeida and Camilo Cienfuegos, went into the Sierra Maestra to avoid being caught. From there they started a guerrilla war against the Batista government. In the Sierra Maestra they set up a small camp. Soon they are surprised by a small army battalion. In this confrontation, Che kills for the first time a human being. Ernesto Guevara would write that night in his diary that he had no remorse in having killed the soldier. The group of guerrillas came to the conclusion that it must have been one of them who told the army where they were. Thus, after brief investigations, they find the traitor and condemn him to death. It is Che Guevara who volunteers to execute the traitor and does it without the slightest regard. He would also write that executing the man in cold blood did not cause him any remorse. According to Fidel Castro's guerrilla comrades, Che always led the action. He was fearless, and that made him feared. It seemed that he was not afraid to die. Huber Matos, one of the 17 survivors, says that Che volunteered for missions, even the most risky ones. Little by little, the revolution took off in Cuba. The guerrilla begins to function and grow. Raúl Castro organizes a small state in the Sierra Maestra, where there are teachers, hunters, gatherers, watchmen, trainings, etc. Several people begin to join them because there is a generalized discontent against Batista. Dictator Batista sends a contingent of 17 battalions against the rebels in the so-called Operation Summer, with a view to put an end to the rebellion. But the revolutionaries chained a series of surprising victories and ended up triumphing almost unscathed against the army's onslaught. This strengthened them even more, and more Cubans joined the armed struggle with them. Camilo Cienfuegos, who comes down from the Sierra with a small regiment and begins to advance through the cities. The Cubans welcome them with open arms, give them food, shelter, and housing. They met little resistance even in those towns that had military barracks. On December 28, 1958, Che began a parallel march, although more delayed than Camilo's, with 300 men until they reached Santa Clara, where they managed to derail an armored train loaded with weapons that was heading to the capital, despite the fact that the government had placed some 3,000 men in the city. In some clashes, there were desertions and surrenders of Batista's troops. On December 28, 1958, Fidel meets with General Rigo Rubido, who surrenders the Moncada barracks. Camilo Cienfuegos enters Havana on January 2, 1959. Fidel Castro entered Havana until January 8, because first he went to be handed over the Moncada barracks, where the Cuban Revolution had symbolically begun. In Havana, a dove, released by some women of the movement, landed on his shoulder. Some followers interpreted this act as a mystical sign. Batista had left the country on December 31, 1958, along with his closest collaborators. The military, upon learning that the dictator had fled, stopped fighting and surrendered. On January 2, Camilo arrived in Havana sheltered by the popular clamor. Camilo was the most loved revolutionary. He was a person with great charisma. The lawyer Manuel Urrutia is appointed as the new president of Cuba, and the post of prime minister is given to Fidel Castro. But in a short time, conflicts between the new president and Fidel begin. In February, the new president of Cuba, Manuel Urrutia, flees to the USA after frictions with Castro for fear that Fidel is going to assassinate him. Castro names himself prime minister and never again calls elections. Che Guevara is commissioned to carry out mass executions. Some were even televised. It was the reign of terror led by a paranoid Fidel and a psychopathic Argentinian. Che executed many innocents, and that is why many Cuban families despise him. That an Argentine was murdering Cuban citizens was not right. But Fidel did it with the purpose that it was Che who received the hatred of the Cubans and not him. By June 12, 1959, Fidel sends Che to Europe, Africa and Asia and establishes the first contact with the USSR. Che offers them the sugar that the Americans do not want to continue buying from Cuba, since it has been seen that Castro is not going to call elections and is nationalizing American companies. The Russians, in order to annoy the Americans, agree to buy sugar from Cuba. The Russians pay with money, and also give them airplanes and oil. Upon Che's return from this tour, Fidel names him president of the National Bank of Cuba and director of the Ministry of Industrialization. It made more Cubans despise him, since it was infamous that an Argentinian should occupy a public position in the revolutionary government. Fidel's government confiscates the lands of foreign companies. Oil companies refuse to refine Russian oil. Fidel nationalizes oil companies. It can already be seen that the revolutionary government is not going to respect private property or the rights and properties of any foreigner. There is a massive exodus of Cubans to Miami. 10 months after the entry into Havana, all American companies were nationalized. Several priests are expelled for speaking ill of the new regime, and others are imprisoned for the same reasons. Government executions and assassinations continued throughout the island. Hundreds of people are killed for supposedly having been collaborators of the Batista regime. It is the revolution of terror. Whoever is not with Fidel, whoever demonstrates against him, ends up dead. American President Dwight David Eisenhower recruits thousands of Cuban exiles to invade Cuba. They were trained in Guatemala and Nicaragua because he did not want the United States to appear to be involved. But there is a change of government and the problem is inherited by John F. Kennedy. Kennedy authorized the attack and on April 15, 1961 the invasion of Cuba began. By April 17, the Cubans sink the American ships of the invaders and leave the combatants trapped with nowhere to return to. Fidel personally directs the defense of the island, and does it very well. In the end they avert the threat and capture more than 1,000 invading soldiers, which they exchange for $50 million, food and medicine for the island. Castro becomes a hero for the Cubans and for all Latin America, because he has defeated the capitalist power of the Americans. His popularity has no equal. Castro thinks, and he thinks correctly, that the Americans will try again to invade the island and overthrow him. Fidel turns to Russia and asks for its support to prevent another invasion. Russia agrees to help him economically and militarily. And they place long-range missiles in Cuba and begin to train the Cuban army. But the Americans become aware of the existence of the Russian missiles in Cuba thanks to a reconnaissance trip of an American plane that kept surveillance spy. Only 2 days later Kennedy is alerted and takes immediate action. He asks Nikita Khrushchev, president of the Union of Soviet Republics, to withdraw his missiles. But Nikita refuses and a diplomatic confrontation begins that will become known as the Missile Crisis. This crisis that made the world tremble with the possibility of a nuclear confrontation between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States lasted 14 days. One of the nights of the crisis, Castro went crazy and asked Russia to launch a nuclear attack on the United States. Nikita Khrushchev at that moment leaves Che Guevara and Castro out of the negotiations, and agrees with Kennedy to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for the US removing the missiles from Turkey. In addition, Khrushchev's negotiation included a promise that the United States would not try to kill Fidel Castro, nor would it try to invade Cuba again. And this was the tragedy of the Cuban people, their sentence. For while Russia prevented the United States from invading and killing Castro, it caused Fidel Castro to enjoy a halo of impunity and do his complete will over Cuba. More than 44 years of his dictatorship were based on the Missile Crisis Pact for the misfortune of the Cuban people.